The auction house smelled like fear and money. Captain Elena Vasquez stood in the shadows of the Kathrani slave market, her stomach turning with disgust she could not show on her face. Around her, wealthy aliens from a dozen species examined their potential purchases. Living beings stood on platforms with chains around their necks, their eyes empty and broken. This was the dark heart of the galaxy, a place where flesh was currency and hope came to die. Elena was not here to buy, she was here to rescue a kidnapped human diplomat's daughter. But the universe had other plans for her that day. The commotion started near the back of the auction floor. Guards shouted in the harsh clicking language of the Kathrani. Something crashed, something roared. The crowd scattered like frightened birds as a cage broke open and chains snapped like dry twigs. What emerged was unlike anything Elena had ever seen. It was young, perhaps the equivalent of a human teenager, but it stood 7 feet tall on digitigrade legs covered in midnight black fur. Its species was called the Orcs, and the galaxy knew them as the most dangerous predators in known space. Their homeworld had been quarantined for centuries. No one went there. No one survived if they did. This young Vorax had golden eyes that burned with pure rage. Its claws were each as long as Elena's fingers, and they dripped with the blood of 3 guards who lay still on the ground. The chains that had held it were military-grade restraints designed to hold creatures 10 times its weight. The Vorax had torn through them like paper. The slave masters panicked. They raised their neural whips, weapons designed to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. The young Vorax snarled, a sound that made Elena's bones vibrate. It was cornered. It was terrified. And it was about to kill everyone in the building. Elena did something that her crew would later call either the bravest or the stupidest thing she had ever done. She stepped out of the shadows and walked directly toward the creature. Her hands were empty and raised. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her breathing slow and steady. The Vorax spun toward her. Those golden eyes locked onto hers. Elena could see the calculation behind the rage. This creature was not just a beast. It was intelligent. It was thinking, and right now, it was deciding whether to tear her apart. Elena stopped 3 meters away, close enough to seem non-threatening, far enough that she might survive the first strike. She did not speak. Instead, she did something that confused everyone watching. She sat down on the dirty floor of the auction house. She crossed her legs. She looked up at the Vorax and waited. The creature's ears flattened against its skull. Its claws flexed. A low growl rumbled from its chest, but it did not attack. The slave masters saw their opportunity. 2 of them raised their whips and fired. Blue electricity arced through the air toward the Vorax. Elena moved without thinking. She threw herself between the creature and the weapons. The electricity hit her instead. Pain exploded through her body. Her muscles locked. She fell. When the agony finally released her, she was lying on the floor, gasping. The Vorax stood over her, looking down with an expression she could not read. The slave masters were backing away, finally understanding that something had changed in this situation. Elena forced herself to speak through the pain. Her voice came out rough and broken. She said one word, just one. "Run!" The Vorax tilted its head. Then it did something that would haunt the dreams of every slave master in that building for the rest of their short lives. It reached down with one massive paw and gently picked Elena up. It cradled her against its chest, like she weighed nothing. And then it ran. The next few minutes were a blur of speed and violence. The Vorax moved through the building like death itself, carrying Elena with one arm while the other tore through any obstacle in their path. Walls meant nothing. Locked doors meant nothing. Guards with weapons meant nothing. The creature burst through the outer wall of the auction house and kept running. Elena's crew found them an hour later, 3 miles from the city in a dense forest. The Vorax had stopped in a small clearing. It had set Elena down on soft moss and was crouching nearby, watching her with those golden eyes. When Elena's first officer approached with weapons raised, the creature's growl made the ground shake. Elena raised her hand. Her voice was weak but commanding. She told her crew to lower their weapons. She told them to back away. They thought she had lost her mind, but they obeyed. Slowly, painfully, Elena sat up. She looked at the young Vorax. She saw the fear behind the fury now. This was a child who had been ripped from its home, chained, tortured, and put on display for wealthy monsters to bid on. A child who had just found one person in the entire galaxy who had shown it kindness. Elena spoke softly. She introduced herself. She explained that she was the captain of a ship. She said that the Vorax was free now. It could go wherever it wanted. She would not try to stop it. The young Vorax made a sound. It was not a growl or a snarl. It was something softer, almost like a question. Then it moved closer to Elena. Closer, closer still, until it was right beside her. And then, this creature that had just killed 6 armed guards and broken through military-grade restraints, this apex predator from a world that made strong warriors weep with fear, curled up beside Elena's feet and rested its head on her lap. Elena's first officer almost shot it out of pure shock. Elena stopped him with a look. She reached down and placed her hand on the creature's head. The fur was surprisingly soft. The Vorax made a sound like a purr mixed with a sigh. Its eyes closed. Elena sat there in the forest, running her fingers through the fur of one of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures, and she understood something that most species had forgotten. Power was not everything. Strength was not everything. Sometimes the fiercest beings in the universe just wanted someone to trust, someone who would stand between them and the pain. Someone who would say run instead of stay and fight. The Vorax stayed with Elena. Her crew was terrified at first, but fear slowly turned to fascination. The creature, who Elena named Shadow because of its dark fur and silent movements, proved to be incredibly intelligent. It learned human speech within weeks, its deep voice rumbling through the ship's corridors. It learned to control its strength, to be gentle with the fragile humans around it. But Shadow never forgot what it was, and neither did anyone who threatened Captain Vasquez. Word spread through the criminal underworld. The human captain had a Vorax bodyguard. The human captain was untouchable. Pirates who had once targeted her ship now changed course when they saw her approaching. Bounty hunters turned down contracts on her head. Even the Kathrani slave masters learned to fear her name. 6 months after the rescue, Elena was ambushed on a space station by 12 assassins hired by a crime lord she had angered. They cornered her in a cargo bay. They thought they had her. They did not know that Shadow had followed her from the ship, moving through the shadows like smoke. The fight lasted 8 seconds. 11 assassins died. The 12th escaped only because Shadow let it go. Elena wanted a messenger. She wanted the galaxy to know what happened to those who came for her. But what truly surprised people was not Shadow's violence. It was the gentleness that came after. When Elena sat down, shaking from adrenaline, Shadow curled around her. It pressed its massive head against her side. It made that purring sound. And Elena, the hardened captain who had faced death more times than she could count, let herself be comforted by a creature that could kill her with a single swipe. The rescued diplomat's daughter was found eventually. Elena returned her to her family and collected a modest reward. But she had gained something far more valuable from that mission. She had gained Shadow, and Shadow had gained her. Years passed. The legend grew. Captain Vasquez and her Vorax guardian became famous throughout the galaxy. Some said Elena had magical powers that controlled the beast. Some said she had saved Shadow's life, and the creature owed a life debt. Some said it was simply that humans were insane, and only they would think to befriend a monster. The truth was simpler and more profound. Elena had seen a frightened child where others saw a beast. She had offered kindness where others offered chains, and Shadow had recognized something in her that no other species had ever shown the Vorax. Respect, trust, love. On the night before Elena's 50th birthday, she sat on the observation deck of her ship, watching the stars drift by. Shadow lay beside her, its massive body curled around her chair. Gray had started to appear in Shadow's fur now. Vorax lived long lives, but Shadow was no longer a cub. They had grown old together. Elena rested her hand on Shadow's head. The Vorax made its familiar purring sound, and Elena thought about the moment in that auction house when she had sat down on the dirty floor and waited. She had not known what would happen. She had simply known that chains and whips were wrong. She had simply known that fear deserved to be answered with compassion. The galaxy still did not understand humans. They were soft. They were weak. They lived short lives and died from things that stronger species simply shrugged off. But they did things that no other species would even consider. They befriended monsters. They showed mercy to their enemies. They stood between predators and pain, taking the hurt into themselves. Shadow opened its golden eyes and looked up at Elena. After all these years, they could communicate without words. The Vorax's gaze held gratitude, devotion, and something that most scientists would say animals could not feel. Love. Elena smiled and scratched behind Shadow's ear. The apex predator of a quarantined world, the terror of the slave markets, the legend that made assassins flee, leaned into her touch like a contented house cat. This was what humans did. They found the fiercest creatures in the universe, the ones that everyone else feared and hated and chained. And they loved them. They sat down in dirty auction houses and offered their empty hands. They took electrical whips to the back. They said run instead of stay and fight. And somehow, impossibly, the fierce creatures loved them back. Shadow's eyes closed again. Its breathing slowed into sleep. Elena kept watching the stars, her hand never leaving her companion's fur. The galaxy was vast and cold and often cruel. But in this small ship, in this quiet moment, there was warmth. There was trust. There was a bond that chains could never create and violence could never break. A fierce cub had snapped its chains that day in the auction house. But it had not run toward freedom. It had run toward something better. It had run toward home. And home, as Elena had taught it, was not a place. Home was a person who would sit down on a dirty floor and wait. Home was a hand offered in kindness. Home was someone worth curling beside, someone worth protecting, someone worth loving for a lifetime. The stars drifted past, the ship hummed its quiet song. And a human and her monster slept peacefully, together, as they had for 20 years, as they would until the very end.